Under the crimson stretch of the evening sky, the land lay hushed as though the desert itself was holding its breath. A lone wind traced the ridges of the hills, carrying with it the faint scent of dust, smoke, and something far more delicate, an unspoken prayer lingering in the air. Somewhere between the silence of the canyon walls and the sigh of the cottonwoods by the stream, her story began. She was not the kind of woman anyone would have noticed before, just another quiet soul who worked, who endured, who hid her tenderness from a world that knew little of mercy. Yet fate has a way of finding the forgotten, of lifting the broken when no hand dares reach. And on this night she walked, barefoot, torn, trembling, toward a future she did not yet know she deserved. Her steps left no sound on the dry earth. Each mark in the dust was a testimony, not of weakness, but of survival. Beneath the bruises that mapped her skin, beneath the ache that weighed her body down, there flickered the smallest flame, a will to keep moving. It was not hope, not yet. It was more fragile than that, more fleeting. But it carried her forward, one step at a time, toward a cabin hidden between the shadows of forgotten trees. She could not have known that within those wooden walls, where grief had dwelled too long, the ground was ready for healing, for something new to grow. Inside, a man stirred. Jonas, the rancher, whose life had been reduced to silence and memory, opened his door as dawn pressed its pale fingers across the horizon. His heart had long been buried with his past, yet in the dim light he saw her, this girl with torn dress and haunted eyes, lips cracked from thirst, whispering with the last of her strength, "Please don't judge me." The words fell into him like seeds into waiting soil. He could have turned away, could have shut the door and silenced the burden. Instead, he stepped closer, arms steady, gaze unflinching. The choice he made in that instant was not only to carry her inside, but to carry her pain alongside his own. The night that followed was not loud with tears or confessions. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows wounds to breathe. She lay upon a bed that had once belonged to love now lost, while he kept vigil just outside the door, staring at the endless hills as though they might answer what his heart refused to admit. That the fragile spark he thought long dead was alive again. By morning her hands trembled over bread and water, her eyes refusing the reflection in the mirror she veiled with cloth. And he, though he said nothing, felt the weight of her silence more deeply than words could ever bear. The days blurred softly. The rhythm of his footsteps through the cabin, the offering of food, the presence of a protector who asked nothing in return, became the unseen balm to her wounds. And though she barely spoke, though her voice was little more than the whisper of a needle through fabric, it was enough. Enough to remind her that if she could still sew, still stitch something together, perhaps she was not lost entirely. Perhaps brokenness did not mean the end. Perhaps it meant the chance to be remade. This was not a love born of sudden passion, nor of reckless fire. It was a love whispered into existence through patience, through care, through the healing of scars, both visible and unseen. And though the storm of the past still gathered beyond the horizon, though the threat of those who wished her gone still lingered in the shadows, something stronger was rising between them. A quiet, steady bond that would refuse to be crushed. If this story already stirs something inside you, if you feel the pull of hope, the warmth of healing, the gentle truth that even in the darkest night light can return, then I invite you to stay with us. Share your thoughts. Let your heart speak in the comments, and if you wish for more tales that heal and embrace your soul, let your support shine through a like or a simple subscription. Your presence here keeps the fire alive, allowing these stories of resilience, romance, and renewal to keep flowing. And as this tale unfolds, step by step, heart by heart, may you find in it not only love, but also the healing reminder that even shattered souls can bloom again beneath the wide and endless sky. And so, as the cabin doors closed gently on that fragile dawn, the journey did not end. It was only beginning, leading them toward a destiny neither had expected, but both desperately needed. The sun rose with a soft gold that spilled gently across the cabin walls, filtering through cracks in the old wood like threads of quiet mercy. Ellie stirred beneath the blanket, her breath shallow, her body aching in places she wished she could forget. She did not ask how she came here, nor why a man who owed her nothing had carried her from the edges of despair. Instead, she listened. To the creak of the porch boards outside, to the steady rhythm of boots moving with a kind of patience she had never known from men before. Jonas did not enter quickly, did not demand words she was not yet ready to give. He tended to the fire, to the mule in the yard, to the slow labor of keeping life alive in this lonely place. And in his quiet, she felt something unfamiliar. Safety. The hours stretched gently, marked only by the sound of his footsteps returning with water from the stream, the scrape of wood against metal as he fixed a broken latch, the faint hum of a tune he did not realize had escaped his lips. Ellie stayed still, but her eyes followed. She had lived too long in shadows to trust easily, but there was something in the weight of his silence that eased the trembling in her chest. His grief was written in the way his shoulders bent, in the careful manner he set things down, as if afraid even wood or stone might shatter. And perhaps it was because his sorrow matched her own that she began, in tiny fragments, to breathe again. At first, her voice was nothing more than the rustle of fabric, the hesitant scrape of a chair when she rose to stand, though her legs threatened to fail her. She found herself tracing the patterns of old stitches on a shirt left folded near the bed. Her fingers remembered what her mind feared to hold, the act of creating, of mending. She held a needle without thread, pressing it lightly against her thumb, as though testing whether she could still claim some small part of herself. When Jonas noticed, he did not interrupt. He simply placed a spool of thread on the table, left it there without a word, and stepped outside. That gesture lingered longer than any sentence could. The days wove into one another like the quiet stitching she began to attempt at dusk. Her voice returned in pieces, carried on simple questions. Is the water near? Do you grow anything here? Each answer from him delivered with the same measured calm. He never pressed for more. He never asked her to recount what had been taken from her. Instead, he allowed her to shape the silence, to fill it only when she was ready. That freedom was its own kind of healing, more powerful than balm or bandage. Ellie found herself watching the hills beyond the porch, how they blazed with color at sunset, how the sky seemed vast enough to hold sorrow without breaking. In that immensity, she felt less small. The shame that had once crushed her chest loosened its grip, if only slightly, because here, between the weathered walls and the open fields, she was not defined by what had been done to her. She was simply alive. And sometimes that was enough. Jonas, too, found his own spirit shifting. Where once his evenings were drowned in silence, now he lingered at the doorway, listening for the sound of her moving within. The grief he had carried for a decade did not vanish, but it no longer felt like a chain. Instead, it became a bond, binding him not to loss, but to the fragile, steady courage of the woman beneath his roof. She reminded him that life, however scarred, could still ask to be lived. As nights grew cooler, he lit a fire that warmed the small cabin. Ellie sat near it, her eyes reflecting the flames, her hands busy with patches of cloth that slowly turned into something whole. She did not speak of the past, but when she finally asked, "If I can still sew, does that mean I'm still a person?" Jonas had no words. He only looked down, his throat tight with something he could not name. It was in that silence, however, that she understood his answer. Their bond was not forged in declarations, but in the everyday miracles of trust rebuilt. A meal left at the table, a blanket adjusted when she shivered, a moment of laughter that slipped from her lips one morning and startled them both. These small sparks became the fire that slowly thawed the frost of their separate griefs. What grew between them was not sudden nor reckless. It was patient, steady, healing, like spring grass pushing through soil hardened by winter. And though the world beyond their cabin still stirred with danger, though shadows of vengeance whispered her name, for now there was this, a fragile peace, a fragile closeness, the kind that taught her to lift her head again and taught him to open his heart once more. And as the days stretched forward, carrying them toward an uncertain horizon, both knew deep within that the story was not about to rest. It was only gathering strength for what waited beyond the ridge. The morning light stretched long and golden across the land, painting the hills in a quiet glow that seemed to promise renewal. In the hush of that hour, Ellie stepped onto the porch for the first time without trembling. Her bare feet touched the rough boards, and the wood carried its memory into her bones, warmth stored from 100 forgotten dawns. She leaned against the post, breathing in air sharp with pine and dust, the kind of air that carried both the ache of the past and the whisper of healing yet to come. Jonas stood at a distance, saddling the mule, his movements unhurried, precise. He did not look at her at once, but he felt her presence the way the earth feels the sun before it rises, quiet yet undeniable. She had begun to move differently now. The shame that once weighed upon her shoulders was loosening, replaced by a fragile steadiness, as though each step she dared outside was a vow to herself. "I am still here." She carried a small basket in her hands, one Jonas had left by the door. She gathered herbs growing wild near the cabin, her fingers brushing their leaves with reverence. The act was simple, but it stitched her heart closer to life, reminding her that her hands could nurture as well as tremble. Jonas watched, his chest tightening at the sight of her bent over the soil, strands of hair falling loose against the morning light. She was no longer only the broken girl who had whispered for mercy. She was becoming a woman who claimed her place in the open air. Inside the cabin, the changes were just as quiet, just as profound. She no longer veiled the mirror. At first, she had avoided her reflection as if it carried the weight of every bruise, every cruel word etched into her skin. But one evening, she let the cloth fall. Her gaze lingered, unsteady yet brave, until she saw not only the scars, but also the eyes that still burned with life. That night, Jonas heard her laugh, soft, fleeting, like a stream breaking through stones. It startled him, not because he had forgotten the sound of laughter, but because he had forgotten how deeply he longed for it. Ellie's voice returned in fuller shapes. She began to tell him stories, small ones, fragments of her childhood, the scent of bread baking in a house long gone, the memory of her mother stitching under lamplight. Each story carried both ache and comfort, weaving her past into the fragile fabric of their present. Jonas listened with the patience of a man who knew loss too well, and his silence was never heavy. It was a shelter, a space for her words to land safely. She felt herself softening in his presence, not because she was weak, but because she no longer had to be strong alone. For Jonas, each day with her was a slow unraveling of his own grief. The cabin that had been nothing more than wood and dust became alive again, bread warming on the hearth, the faint hum of her voice, the sight of fabric neatly folded where once only silence dwelled. He caught himself watching her, not with pity, but with awe. To see someone rise from the weight of cruelty, to choose life again, was to witness a miracle more powerful than any he had prayed for. Her presence was a balm, reminding him that even wounds carried for years could find a place to breathe, to ease, to heal. The bond between them deepened, not through grand gestures, but through moments woven of trust. When he left a carved wooden comb at her bedside, she accepted it with a quiet smile. When she stitched a tear in his shirt and left it folded by the fire, he touched the fabric with reverence, as though it were sacred. Their connection was not rushed. It grew like roots beneath soil, unseen but unbreakable. And in that growth, both found pieces of themselves they had thought forever lost. Yet beneath the warmth of their days, a shadow lingered at the edge of the horizon. Jonas felt it in the tightening of his jaw when riders passed on the distant road. Ellie sensed it in the way the nights sometimes stretched too quiet, as if the land itself waited. The past was not finished with them. Clayton's name was a ghost neither dared to speak, but both knew it hovered still. And while healing stitched their hearts together, danger threatened to tear at the seams. Still, in that fragile moment between yesterday's sorrow and tomorrow's storm, there was peace, a peace so rare that even the earth seemed to lean closer to hold it. And as the days moved forward, Ellie began to believe that perhaps life could offer her more than survival. Perhaps it could offer her love, the kind not born of demand or cruelty, but of choice, patience, and quiet devotion. And though neither she nor Jonas had spoken it aloud, both hearts knew the truth. The journey that bound them was only beginning, and love, like healing, was already taking root. The days lengthened into weeks, and in the quiet rhythm of the ranch, Ellie began to find a fragile harmony between her scars and the small joys of survival. Morning light now carried her steps into the yard, where the earth waited patiently for her touch. She planted herbs behind the cabin, her fingers pressing seeds into soil with a tenderness that seemed to heal not only the land, but something deep within herself. The sight of tiny shoots breaking through dirt filled her chest with a strange warmth, a reminder that new life could rise even from ground once left barren. Jonas would watch from the porch, his weathered hands resting on his knees, and though he spoke little, his eyes carried the steady reassurance of a man who understood that some miracles needed no words. It was in the evenings, however, that their bond deepened most. As the fire burned low, Ellie sat near the hearth, stitching torn fabric into whole shapes again. Her voice, soft and steady, filled the cabin with questions that were less about answers and more about closeness. What the land had once been like, where the streams ran, how Jonas had come to live here alone. He answered simply, his words carrying the weight of memory, and though he never confessed fully the loss of his wife, Ellie felt it in the pause between his sentences, in the way his gaze lingered on the old blanket folded by the bed. She did not pry. She only listened, her presence itself an offering of healing. Jonas, in turn, learned the contours of her silence. He noticed how she avoided sudden noises, how her shoulders stiffened when the wind slammed the door, how her eyes darted at the sound of hooves in the distance. He never reached too quickly, never pressed too hard. Instead, he gave her the gift of steadiness, bread baked with care, water fetched before she asked, tools repaired so she might use them with her own hands. His love was not a blaze, but a steady flame, warm enough to soften the shadows, constant enough to remind her she was safe. One night, under a sky stitched with stars, Ellie stepped outside barefoot, the cool earth grounding her trembling thoughts. Jonas joined her silently, standing just close enough for her to feel the breadth of his presence. For a long time, neither spoke. The night wrapped around them like a cloak, and the silence was not heavy. It was healing, a sacred space where brokenness no longer defined them. At last, Ellie whispered, almost to the wind, that she feared she might never be whole again. Jonas turned his gaze toward her, his voice low but steady, telling her that wholeness was not about forgetting wounds, but about carrying them without letting them destroy the light still inside. She met his eyes then, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe him. From that night forward, a subtle change bloomed between them. When Ellie laughed, the sound lingered longer. When Jonas spoke, there was a softness in his tone that had not been there before. They began to share not only silence, but small touches. The brush of her hand against his as she passed him a cup, the way his shoulder rested nearer to hers when they sat by the fire. Nothing rushed, nothing claimed, but in those fleeting moments lived the promise of something deeper, something that belonged to them alone. Yet beyond their fragile cocoon, the world stirred with unrest. Clayton's anger traveled through the town like wildfire, whispers of vengeance carried by men too fearful to speak his name openly. Tommy's conscience weighed heavy under threats he could no longer ignore. Ellie sensed the shift before words confirmed it. The horizon seemed sharper, the nights more watchful. Healing had given her back her voice, her laughter, even her hope. But shadows still lingered, and both she and Jonas knew that the past would not release her so easily. Still, as they sat on the porch, watching dawn rise like a quiet prayer, Ellie placed her stitched cloth beside Jonas's hand, a symbol of life reclaimed. He covered it with his calloused palm, and in that shared gesture, both knew that whatever storm awaited them, they would face it together. Their healing was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of love, fragile yet fierce, ready to be tested against the fire waiting beyond the ridge. The wind carried the scent of summer grass across the valley, mingling with wood smoke that curled from the cabin's chimney. Life had taken on a rhythm that neither Ellie nor Jonas had expected. Quiet mornings with the sound of water being drawn from the well, afternoons spent in small labours of repair, and evenings where firelight softened the silence between them into something almost tender. Yet beneath the surface of that peace was a growing awareness. Each glance held longer than it should, each brush of hands sparking warmth neither dared to name. Love, unspoken but undeniable, was taking root in the soil of their shared survival. Ellie found her hands steadier as she worked in the garden she had coaxed from the hard ground. Tiny shoots had grown into green promise, and when she bent to touch their leaves, she felt a quiet pride bloom within her chest. She was no longer merely a shadow of herself. She was creating, tending, healing. Each sprig of thyme, each blade of sage, whispered that she belonged not to the cruelty of the past, but to the life she was nurturing here. Jonas would watch her from the porch, the lines of grief on his face softening as her laughter, hesitant but real, drifted toward him. That sound was more precious than any harvest he could reap. One evening, as twilight deepened into indigo, Ellie carried a lantern outside, its glow spilling across the worn boards of the porch. She sat with Jonas in the hush of the night, the stars scattered like silver dust above them. For the first time, she told him about the night she had nearly lost everything, not in the detail of violence, but in the language of memory. How silence had felt heavier than chains, how shame had pressed her down until she could barely breathe. Jonas did not interrupt. His hand, rough and steady, rested over hers, a simple gesture that told her she was not alone in the telling. When her voice faltered, he held it for her, offering the kind of strength that asked nothing in return. The sharing of pain became a bridge. Jonas, who had buried his heart with his wife years ago, spoke quietly of the fever that had stolen her from him. His words cracked in places, worn with years of silence, but Ellie listened as he had listened to her, without judgment, without fear. She touched his arm gently, and in her eyes he found not pity, but understanding. Two lives scarred by loss, now stitched together not by duty or chance, but by the fragile thread of compassion. The days that followed carried a new intimacy. Ellie began to leave small tokens of care for him, a mended shirt folded neatly by the fire, bread baked with herbs from her garden, a scarf she stitched with delicate precision, though her hands still trembled at times. Jonas, in turn, carved for her a small wooden bird, its wings outstretched, a symbol of freedom and resilience. When he placed it in her palm, she closed her fingers around it as though holding not just a carving, but a promise. Their closeness was not loud or hurried. It grew like a melody played softly on a string, tender notes weaving through the hours of their days. When Ellie brushed past Jonas in the cabin, her shoulder grazing his, he did not pull away. When he placed a hand at the small of her back to steady her, as she stepped down from the porch, she did not flinch. These simple moments became sacred, each touch a reminder that love could be born from gentleness, not demand. Yet even as healing surrounded them, the shadow of danger thickened. Whispers from town reached Jonas through travellers who stopped by the stream. Clayton had not forgotten, and his fury was rising. Tommy, burdened by guilt and fear, had been seen riding alone, eyes hollow, carrying secrets that pressed him toward choices he could no longer avoid. Ellie felt the air tighten with each rumour, though she did not speak of it aloud. The peace they cherished was fragile, a tender flame in the wind. Still, She refused to let fear steal the life she was reclaiming. At dawn, she walked barefoot into the fields, letting dew cool her skin, her heart whispering prayers, not of desperation, but of gratitude. Jonas followed at a distance, watching her silhouette against the pale light of morning. And in that moment, he knew with certainty, she was no longer a guest in his home. She was part of it, part of him, the very reason his heart beat steadier than it had in years. And though the storm of the past gathered at the edges of their world, Ellie and Jonas clung to this fragile present, allowing it to weave love from sorrow, courage from loss, and healing from pain. What they did not yet know was that love, once awakened, had the power to stand even against the fiercest shadows. And soon that truth would be tested beneath the unforgiving sun. The morning broke with a restless wind, carrying dust across the horizon, and with it came a silence too sharp to ignore. Jonas knew before he saw the figure approaching on horseback that the peace they had built was about to be tested. The rider was Tommy, his frame weary, his face bruised from battles that were more than flesh and bone. Ellie stood on the porch, her fingers tightening around the wooden bird Jonas had carved for her, and in her eyes lay both recognition and fear. She remembered him not only as the boy who had once bound her wrists, but also as the trembling soul who had cut her free. That memory kept her rooted to the ground when every instinct told her to flee. Tommy dismounted with hands that shook, his boots dragging against the dirt as though the weight of the world hung from his shoulders. His eyes would not meet hers at first, shadowed by shame too heavy to carry. But when they did, the truth shone through. He was not there to finish the cruelty he had once been ordered to do. He was there to confess the war inside him. Jonas stepped forward, rifle slung steady, his voice calm but edged with steel. He was not a man to gamble with trust, but neither was he blind to the sight of another soul standing at the edge of ruin. The air between them burned with a choice unspoken. Would Tommy stand with them, or would he be the knife in their back? Ellie moved first. She stepped down from the porch, her bare feet stirring the dust, her gaze locked on him. "You had your chance to kill me," she said, her voice soft but firm, a thread of strength woven through her trembling. "And you didn't." The words hung in the space between them, heavier than any weapon. Tommy's knees buckled, his gun slipping from his hand to the earth, and he dropped where he stood. His breath broke into sobs, words spilling of threats, of Clayton's wrath, of the noose that would find him if he dared to disobey again. Yet beneath the fear was something else, an ember of defiance, faint but alive. Jonas watched him with the eyes of a man who had buried too much to waste compassion recklessly. Still, he saw in Tommy what he had once feared in himself, the danger of becoming hollow, of letting silence make him complicit. So he spoke, his voice cutting through the night like the crack of thunder. "Then it's time you choose. Stand with her or die with him." The words were not cruel, they were truth, sharp and unavoidable, and in that truth something shifted. Tommy lifted his head, tears carving paths down the dirt of his face, and for the first time in his life he chose not cowardice, but courage. Ellie watched him, her own heart torn between fear and forgiveness. Yet as he knelt before her, broken not by fists, but by guilt, she felt something deeper stir within her chest. She remembered the mercy he had shown when no one else did, and though she could never erase the scars of what had been done, she understood that healing was not only about her own survival. It was about giving others the chance to rise as well. She reached out, not in embrace, but in acknowledgement, and that single gesture was enough to turn his shame into resolve. From that night forward, the fragile peace of the cabin was gone, replaced by preparation. The three of them became bound by something larger than their pain, the necessity to stand against Clayton and the law twisted by his father's badge. Jonas trained Tommy with the rifle, steadying his trembling hands until they found their mark. Ellie stitched not only torn fabric, but also bandages, readying herself for what might come. The cabin that had once been a refuge became a fortress, not of stone or steel, but of will, of hearts refusing to bow. Yet, even in the shadow of looming battle, moments of tenderness bloomed. Ellie's laughter, though rare, rang stronger, and Jonas felt the sound etch itself into his chest like a promise he would never let go. At night, as firelight flickered across the walls, her hand brushed his when she passed him bread, and though neither spoke of it, the warmth lingered longer than flame. Tommy, too, found healing in their presence, his guilt reshaped into a vow to protect rather than destroy. What had begun as survival was now transforming into something fiercer, something unbreakable. And so, under the wide sky, where stars burned like watchful eyes, the three of them stood together, no longer bound by fear alone, but by the quiet strength of chosen family. Love had begun its work, patient and steady, even as danger closed in. The storm was gathering, its roar echoing beyond the hills, but within the cabin's wooden walls there was a light that no shadow could smother, that light, born of trust, forgiveness, and the healing power of love, was what they carried with them into the uncertain dawn, ready for whatever the world demanded next. The town had always seemed distant, a place Ellie imagined only in fragments. The echo of boots striking the saloon floor, the laughter of men who believed their power unshakable, the quiet fear that lingered in women's eyes when Clayton passed by. But now, as she rode beside Jonas and Tommy under the glare of the sun, she felt the earth beneath her pulse with a different kind of certainty. This was no longer the trembling escape of a hunted woman. This was the return of someone who had found her voice. The mule carried Jonas steady at the front, his rifle strapped across his back, his presence calm as stone. Tommy rode close, his lips still split from Clayton's fists, but his jaw locked with defiance. And Ellie, bruises faded into scars, hair loose against the wind, sat tall in the saddle, the weight of her silence replaced by something harder, stronger: truth. When they reached the edge of Main Street, the air shifted. Conversations fell quiet, glasses paused mid-air, and the sound of hooves carried further than it should have. Clayton stood outside the saloon, laughter cut short as the three approached. For a moment his arrogance faltered, but he masked it quickly, his grin curling into mockery. Yet as Jonas dismounted and pulled Jack, Clayton's other boy, beaten and bound, into the dust, the crowd stirred uneasily. And when Ellie stepped down, her bare feet pressing against the same earth where she had once been condemned to die, the silence deepened into something that could not be ignored. Jonas's voice rang steady, carried on the hot wind. He pointed to Ellie, his tone unflinching, and told the town what had been done. A girl who said no once and nearly lost her life for it. The words rippled through the crowd, Disbelief at first, then anger, then shame. Clayton tried to laugh, but Tommy cut him off, tossing the blood-stained fabric of Ellie's torn dress into the dirt. His confession spilled out like fire. He had been ordered to kill her, had stood on the edge of that choice, and had chosen to let her live because he could no longer deny the truth. His trembling voice became a roar when he said it before them all. "I was there. I know what he did." The sheriff pushed through the crowd, his face crimson, torn between blood and law. But even his voice could not drown the murmurs rising like thunder. Mothers clutched their children, men stepped back from Clayton's side, and the false strength that had once cloaked him began to unravel. Ellie, though her knees trembled, stepped forward. She unwrapped the cloth from her arm, showing the rope burns carved deep into her skin, proof no lie could erase. Her voice, though soft, cut sharper than any blade. This is what happens when truth is silenced. This is what happens when fear rules over justice. For a moment, no one moved. The town held its breath. Then, like a tide breaking, whispers turned to words. Monster, devil, not fit to wear a badge. Clayton's laughter cracked, his eyes darting for allies, but none stepped forward. His father, the sheriff, stood frozen, torn apart by the weight of blood ties and the crumbling authority of the badge on his chest. At last, with hands that shook, he drew the irons from his belt and snapped them around his son's wrists. Clayton cursed, fought, spat fury into the dust, but his cries only revealed the truth. He was small, his power nothing but fear, and fear had lost its grip. Ellie's chest rose and fell with the force of the moment. The shame that had once chained her now burned away, replaced by a strength she had never imagined she carried. Around her, faces once turned aside met her gaze, some with guilt, some with awe, but all with the understanding that silence had ended. She was no longer a victim hidden in shadows. She was a woman who had spoken, and in speaking had set the town free from its cowardice. Jonas placed a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her as the dust settled. Tommy stood at her other side, head bowed, but for once not in shame. He stood in allegiance, ready to bear the weight of the truth he had finally chosen. Together, the three of them faced the street, not as fugitives, but as something stronger, something unbreakable. And though the fight seemed won, Ellie knew the road ahead was far from gentle. A town freed from fear must learn how to live in its own courage. A sheriff who turned against his son must live with the fracture of blood and duty. And she, Jonas, and Tommy must face the question of what comes after victory, when healing is no longer a hope, but a responsibility. As the crowd dispersed, whispers still hanging in the air, Ellie lifted her face to the sun. The warmth spread across her skin like a promise. She was not the girl who had been left for dead. She was the woman who had chosen to rise. And though shadows lingered, she felt the steady presence of Jonas beside her, the renewed strength of Tommy at her back, and in her heart, the quiet certainty that love and healing would carry them into whatever came next. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter for the broken. It had become a home, breathing again with laughter, work, and the warmth of shared burdens. Ellie woke with the sun on her face, her body no longer weighed down by shame, but lifted by the quiet rhythm of days she could claim as her own. She planted rows of herbs that grew into fragrant gardens, stitched torn cloth until it looked new, and filled the air with gentle melodies hummed under her breath. The mirror that once remained covered now reflected her face freely, the scars no longer a prison, but a testament to her survival. Every time she caught her own gaze, she saw not the girl who had been left for dead, but the woman who had risen, stronger, softer, and alive. Jonas, too, felt the shift within himself. The ghost of his wife's absence, though it would never leave entirely, no longer defined his nights. The porch where he once sat alone became a place of quiet companionship, Ellie often beside him, her presence a balm to years of grief. Tommy joined them there, no longer the boy bowed beneath shame, but a man learning what it meant to stand for something beyond fear. Together they carried the weight of the past, but it felt lighter now, shared among three hearts that had chosen to remain when walking away would have been easier. Seasons turned, each one marking new growth. In spring, Ellie's laughter startled the birds as she chased sunlight across the meadow, her hair streaming behind her like a banner of freedom. In summer, Jonas taught her how to ride with a steady hand on hers, guiding her through fields where the grass brushed their boots and the sky stretched endless. Autumn came with harvests from the soil she had once thought barren, baskets full of herbs, fruits, and grains, each plant a reminder that life could bloom even after devastation. Winter wrapped them in snow, but inside the cabin, firelight glowed over shared meals, quiet stories, and the comfort of knowing none of them would ever face the cold alone again. Love between Ellie and Jonas unfolded not in sudden passion, but in the slow weaving of trust, the patience of two souls who had learned that healing takes time. It was in the way he adjusted her shawl when the wind blew too sharp, in the way she smoothed the weariness from his brow with a touch of her hand. Their closeness was a flame tended carefully, glowing warmer with each passing day. The love they built was not a fire that burned recklessly, but a steady hearth that promised safety, belonging, and warmth. Tommy found his place not as an outsider, but as family. His loyalty no longer bound by guilt, he worked the land with Jonas, rode the trails, and protected the cabin with vigilance born of choice. Ellie, who once trembled at his presence, now trusted him enough to hand him the seeds she had saved, watching as he planted them into soil with reverence. His laughter, awkward at first, became more natural, and in those moments Ellie knew the truth. Healing was not hers alone. It was shared, multiplying in those who dared to believe they could be remade. The town, too, bore its transformation. After Clayton was taken away, people learned to speak more openly, no longer shackled by fear. Whispers of shame turned into conversations of courage. Men who once stood idle began to protect the weak. Women who once hid their suffering found their voices. Ellie would sometimes walk through the streets with Jonas and Tommy beside her, and though some still lowered their eyes with guilt for what they had ignored, many met her gaze with respect, even gratitude. She had not only survived, she had forced the town itself to awaken. Yet the most profound change was within her own heart. The girl who once begged only not to be judged had discovered something far greater. She was worthy of love, of joy, of peace. She no longer lived merely to endure, but to thrive. Nights by the fire were filled with the sound of her laughter, blending with Jonas's low chuckle, with Tommy's light-hearted stories. And as she stitched new quilts from scraps once deemed useless, she realized the truth. Broken things can be made whole again, not by erasing the past, but by weaving it into something stronger. Their love became more than romance. It became a sanctuary. A place where pain was not denied but embraced, where wounds became proof of survival, where healing flowed not just through words, but through the daily choice to stay, to care, to hope. The cabin, once silent with grief, now glowed with life, and each dawn was a reminder that love had conquered what fear had tried to destroy. And so, as Ellie stood at the threshold one morning, the sun spilling warmth over the valley, she felt the weight of everything they had endured settle into something steady and unbreakable. She turned to Jonas, his eyes steady on hers, and to Tommy, whose loyalty no longer wavered. A smile curved her lips, not fragile but radiant, and she whispered a silent vow to the earth itself. To keep choosing love, to keep choosing healing, to keep choosing life. If this story touched a corner of your heart, if you felt the warmth of love reborn from ashes, I invite you to let that feeling linger. Leave a comment to share what stirred within you, press like if the tale gave you a moment of healing, and subscribe to walk with us into more stories of love, resilience, and renewal. Your presence keeps these fires burning, and together we can keep reminding the world that even in its darkest corners, love has the power to bloom again.